My specs is a bit skew, so please don't laugh at it, okay? This is from working in the bed and falling asleep, and then the specs, of course, as many of you know, happens. So I thanks so much. I've got a couple of slides. I'll try and make it as quickly. Steph, I've got 15. Kamal, I've got 15. Yeah, okay. You'll just in the last 2 minutes just tell me you have to end. I used this deck instead of the other portfolio, which is the Just Energy Transition, because I think partly so it's quite important that we contextualize it in the work that we've been doing with Karma, Lerato, and others, which is an important project that is being championed and pioneered by the president, which is the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. And you've heard, I mean, many of you who've been around have heard about this over many, many occasions and the impact that we are doing for young people. So I think it's quite important for us to think about it, fittingly so, for how we develop the kind. Oh, so how we develop the future. Is it recording? Because I can talk without the mic. I still got a shop steward voice. Oh, sorry. Is it fine? Okay. So I just want to quickly get through. Oh, you're doing it. Oh, I've got this thing over here. Oh, okay. Sorry. Technology. Okay. So it's just a bit of data, but I'm not going to go through it. But it's just reminding us about how the skills gaps continue to exist. Post democracy. What happens to people when they leave school? What happens to them if they're absorbed into the economy? So you've seen the slide before, and I think we talk through it all the time, and this is your bread and butter. Um, so uh, let's start here. I mean, I think this is quite critical because from our point of view, we're looking at the potential growth sectors, right? And if you look at each and every one of them, there is huge potential for growth. And partly so why we've identified this and not all other sectors is because we think there is the potential for growth over there, right? And that can drive the kind of economic diversification and areas that we require. From digital skills and technology to automotive to agriculture, social services, infrastructure, are all critical sectors. I put that in green there because, sorry, it's not come through very clear, so I'm now worried that I used green before because it's just energy transition, and that's quite important, right? Um, but we're trying to, and large part of my presentation is going to talk about how we've learned from that, in the context of all of every one of this. And really just, I mean, the problem has been that these are interesting growth sectors and potentially can create the kind of employment that's there. But in a sense, what we do find is a lot of lip service. So when you develop the master plans process, you have an automotive master plan. But it's quite interesting in the automotive master plan, right? Potentially, there's about 110,000 people working in this, including the entire value chain. But if you think about the industry in a very specific sense, right? It contributes 8% to total exports. That's 200 billion rand. 65, 70% of that goes into the European market. Now, if you follow what's happening in the EU market, you will see that there's significant changes in the way they want to see products and how products are manufactured. And what I mean by that is that they want to see lower levels of carbon intensity in the manufacturing of the products. So they have what is referred to as a carbon tax adjustment process, CBAM for short. And by 2035, they no longer want to have internal combustion engines, what we produce, right? Petrol in, fumes out, right? They want to have, for example, electric vehicles. Now, if 65% of our entire automotive export sector goes to the European Union, we're in trouble, right? So 2035 is like, sure, that's like 11 years, right? You have to completely overhaul the sector to be able to address that. And what you require fundamentally is a change of skill sets that are going to be important. Young people coming in, new people coming in, retooling, reskilling. So I thought that's a useful example, and where we need to not only pay lip service to skills, because many of these master plans says, yeah, skills is there, but specifically what do you mean? And I thought I wanted to use this just energy transition as an example. Okay, so this is just a quick slide showing that in the context of a just energy transition, right, coupled with the socioeconomic challenges that we have there, isn't it an opportunity to reset in a sense, to develop a new kind of growth paradigm that talks about industrialization, that talks about new economic development, that talks about new sectors in the context of trying to also address some of the socioeconomic challenges that are there. And I think it is. It creates an opportunity, and I'll argue why I think that is so. And how we need to fit skills in, right, in that kind of environment. So extreme levels of poverty, weak economy, unsustainable levels of unemployment, unequal country, most carbon intensive major economy in the world, right? Relative to our carbon emissions per GDP per capita. Sorry, vulnerable to physical climate risk, and you see that for those who live in Jacobs and Bweni and parts of the KZN province. You know, 2 or 3 major floods in the last 4 years, right? That's directly because of climate change. Insurers no longer want to insure if we don't adapt and put in sufficient infrastructure to be able to deal with that. So it provides us an opportunity, and I think that's quite critical for us. So I wanted to come to this because this is quite important. So the reason why I put that part as green, which is a just energy transition, was partly because I think so it's not a master plan per se. So we've been tasked to develop an investment plan, and I'm sure many of you know that we are in the process of having completed the negotiations with the international partner group of countries: the US, UK, France, Germany, the EIB, the European Investment Bank, to look at funding a just transition in South Africa. And it's packaged at 8.5 billion. There's lots of 8.5 US billion, right? So it's packaged quite as we're selling out. There's lots of ideological debates. But in the context of what I refer to, which is important for our carbon emissions and for us to be able to move in the direction of, decarbonization, it's fundamental. There's no compromise around that. The question is how quick or how slow we'll do that, but we are moving in that direction, and partly so because we've committed to a national determined contribution, which is this over here. Is there a point on this thing? Is it the top one? Yeah, which is this. And the NDC is important because it talks about a target around how much megatons of carbon equivalent we will be reducing by, right? So this means if you want to achieve this range, which is 350 to 420, we have to do a whole set of different things. And of course, it being ambitious, the international partner group came along and said, well, we're prepared to fund some of it, a little bit of concessional funding, grants, and a whole set of different things. So this set into motion us developing an investment plan. And part of that investment plan was pretty much, Steph, what we do in a master plan process. But in actual fact, having spent a bit of time doing it over the past 18 months, I actually think it's what a master plan should have actually gone through, right? Costed what needs to happen in the sectors of the economy. Develop a component of what it means to reskill workers, what it means, for example, to be able to identify the skill sets, what happens in the value chain. And I'll give you some examples of what we did, which is not what is happening in the master plan process, and I think that's the kind of learning that's there. Of course, the transition over 23 to 27, we may change this time frame. It's quite a pretty price. Transitions are expensive. This is 1.5 trillion rand, right? So the numbers is correct, right? Close on to about 95 billion US dollars, right? And it's about, developed countries, private sector investment, DFIs, government philanthropies, and multilateral bank all supporting this. But this is the important part about what we will do in the 5 years. Is electricity decarbonization, because it contributes 42% to our total GHG emissions, right? New energy vehicles, because we're dead. We lose 110,000 jobs if we do not transition into electric vehicles. Green hydrogen, for example, a nascent sector that requires for us to be able to do that. And what's important here is involving skills development, and you see that. We've put that specifically there and not paid lip service to it. And the municipalities that are quite important. So again, for each and every one of these sectors, as you can see, there's a whole set of different things. But what it does require for us in the electricity sector is reskilling for SARM. And SARM means a South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, right? Because the Renewable Master Plan is quite important for decarbonization of the sector. I'll give you another interesting slide closer to the end of my presentation. For transport, job protection and reskilling. This is talking about the electric vehicles and about our large ICE manufacturing component that we have here. For hydrogen, again, for skills development and localization. Nascent sector requires for us to be able to develop that. So what's really nice in the way we've developed this plan and costed it, we've looked at specific details in relation to each and every one of that, right? And of course, research and emerging consultations show the benefits of establishing linkages to a range of value chains underpinning the low carbon energy system and the impending challenges of automotive and transport sectors. So just re-emphasizing that, right? Again, what we've done here, again, is just to emphasize if we're doing investments and making decisions in the shift towards many of these new areas, from repurposing mines and plants, for example, if you're talking about decarbonization, because that is exactly what it is, right? Where the time we get there is the issue for discussion, right? So that's the most important part. Economic diversification is going to be quite critical. Worker and communities are quite critical to this process and enabling conditions. And I think if you look at it, and I won't go through each and every one of it, but I'll share the slides. If you look at it, what is important is that this, of course, creates an opportunity for us to be able to reset and adjust and move in a particular direction. That it, at the center, requires for us to be able to reskill and to develop workers and communities to be able to take advantage of this. Here's some of the dimensions of what we've been talking through. And as you can see, I mean, I think what we're trying to get into is trying to address some of the shortcomings that we experience in other sectors that have to go through transitions in the economy. So this cuts across both electricity, new vehicles, and of course, green hydrogen. So reskilling and upskilling is quite important. And this is focusing on the existing adult workers so they are better equipped to navigate the transition. What we need to do there, of course, is involve skills analysis, identify demand, because we know there is particular demand, and putting in place substantive short and long-term training programs amongst others. So we need to look at that. That's quite critical. Aligning the skills developed system with anticipated labor force needs of the future. And this is quite easily, because you're going to have these new sectors. If you talk about electricity and decarbonization and investments in renewable, it's very, very different from what we're doing right now in the way that we have coal-based economy, or electric vehicles, or green hydrogen as a replacement for hard-to-abate sectors, right? What we can do after 2035. Ensuring foundational skills through education systems, and here we need to look at the adaptive capacity for the broader workforce. This involves curricular transformation, teacher capacity development in the schooling, and post-school systems, especially technical and vocational training for educators and competencies. So this is quite critical for us to be able to ensure that we get alignment in that. And lastly, addressing gender inequality and social exclusions. And particularly these sectors, as it is with mining and energy, they're very exclusionary. Women are not encouraged to participate, to become engineers, and to work in mines or work in these kind of sectors, and I think it's going to be quite critical. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at this and saying, how is it that we can develop specific sets of interventions and also cost it? I'm almost done, guys, okay? So when we said for the focus areas for these up until 2023, 2027, we basically said what is required, right? Is enable a collaborative planning through a dedicated skills hub platform for just transition and the future of work. And that means focusing on coal, renewable energy, green hydrogen, existing vehicles, and NEV value chains. So this is important for us to be able to manage that transition and to develop more detailed specific interventions to address that. Secondly, a skills development zone, centers of specialization for greater alignment of skills supply. And here we need to look at new livelihood skills located in Mpumalanga, Gauteng, and Northern Cape. And what's really nice about the way we looked at it is to look at specific examples and how we need to work within Mpumalanga province. Because you're looking at close on to about 100 to 120,000 workers in the province, including value chains, including those that are working in supply chains. SMMEs all affected if we do transition away from coal and from coal production in generation capacity. So it's quite critical for us to look at it in a very specific and detailed way. And then, of course, using skills and intelligence and localized SDZs to leverage and strategically allocate available PESET funding for that. Because if we don't do that, then I am afraid what will happen is communities and workers will again bear the worst end of a transition. And South African workers know about transition. I was a unionist. We went through a terrible transition between 1993 and 1994 when we entered into the into global markets, right? We didn't adapt. The argument was, don't worry, it will open up new sectors of the economy. We'll create jobs over there, and many years later, 27 years later, we're still not seeing that. And of course, we have the worst unemployment rate. So again, we need to make sure that we deal with this in a much more strategic and coordinated way. So this is an interesting side that Galo does. I don't know if colleagues know Galo, but Galo basically manages the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. And he specifically has been putting emphasis, and this is quite interested, on skills and skills development in the master plan process. Very different to other master plans, and why I'm quite impressed with it. And this is just basically a graph tracking, technology development and skills development between when you start off from the first phase right until you reach your frontier of developing. It's Kenneth will know this is 101, kind of just explaining how you need to see our movement across it. So if you think about the current situation, we're not very far. This is very nascent. We're developing it. We're getting it right. Expansion of existing capacity. And of course, you see that ramps up slightly. And our investment and importance of getting the policy focus right is quite important. And then when we've reached the frontier, that is when we're quite advanced. So we need to think of this as part of our skills development trajectory and making sure that we're ahead of the curve. And we plan, we have intelligence gathering, we move in the way that is able to ensure that as these sectors develop, that the skills are ready and are there. Not behind the curve, because otherwise these things don't happen. And of course, you don't have an integrator. So this is just quite an interesting thing in the way that Galo has presented it. And I think it's really a useful sense of how one could fit in the skills development as we move along the renewable energy and the green energy kind of changes. And my last slide, actually second last slide, but I gave this example partly. It just shows again how industry is moving quite way ahead without us developing and working on skills development. So this data is basically nurse registration. And why I put this here is because we did a bit of a tweak a few years ago around allowing for private sector investment in generation. Never did before. Eskom, sole provider, completely vertically integrated. So we tweaked this, right? And you can see here, we had a bit of a rule that allows for private sector embedded generation. And embedded generation just basically means creating your own energy, right? And you see it's always flat up until 2020, the second quarter of 2022, because we allowed for 1 megawatt and less, right? Now, registration is the last process for when you register your project and you're going to now construct financial close. But here you see an exponential jump in the last 2 years. So you have massive, massive investment. Suddenly, in the first quarter of this year alone, 2,500 megawatts of embedded generation that has been registered. So give you a sense of what it means in terms of capacity development. And I mean, the value chain is quite complex. There's lots of different things. But if I look at solar panels, just solar panels, which is the most important part in the PV production process, there are only 2 manufacturers, by the way. The others have closed them. Seraphim and Art Solar. Yeah, sorry, thanks. And their production capacity as it is right now, maximum, 300. So you have a capacity of localized production of only 600 megawatts. And yet you have a demand of 2,400, 2,500. That's just private sector investment. There's a pipeline of over 10,000 megawatts that we're tracking. And generally speaking, although Chinese products are cheaper, when it comes to wanting to produce, this is the rule generally for any manufacturer, a closer supply chain to where you want to manufacture is always better, even if there's a premium in the price. We are not geared for this, right? We have 2 manufacturers still. We don't have a value chain. Where's the skill sets that are needed for this? And that's the opportunity that it presents itself. And my last slide is just, whoops, is that saying I must keep quiet now? Oh, yeah, okay. My last slide, 1 more minute. And I just think here are the critical steps for us to think through about how we deal with this, right, as a good example. And how I think it's important to replicate what we've done in the just energy transition sector for other master plan processes, so it's not only lip service, right? Start identifying the skills required, because it does require it's a long lead time, 5 to 10 years, roadmap. So I've given the data, right? The data is there. The investment opportunity is there, right? Registration, I showed you the registration. I've showed you what it means for some of the investment decisions that are there. We don't have the skill sets. Why are we not developing it, right? Because otherwise what will happen, it will be imported from China. Cross-cutting nature makes it even more important for strong coordination and planning mechanisms, right? Extended and connected value chains are quite complex. Think about it. This cuts across different things, right? It cuts across coal, renewable energy, green hydrogen. Value chains that include the value chains associated with vehicles and interlinked value chains. We need to think about the skill set that's required and the coordination needed for that to happen. National level strategic support and local level alignment. Again, this is quite important because we also tend to think about skills from a national level and not what it means for Mpumalanga, for example, and how we get the systems and outputs that are relevant for Mpumalanga, right? Or do we expect workers suddenly to migrate? Can't be the case. So we need to think about long-term planning about whether some of these sectors and industrial development can happen in Mpumalanga, and therefore, how do we get the organizations and post-school education training in organizations to be able to churn the relevant skills. And then lastly, of course, mobilization across all stakeholders. You can't do without labor, business, investing in this. So I mean, you saw 1.5 trillion, right? I mean, we took a hammering from the unions, and rightly so. It's a bit of a dumb thing, right? Of the 1.5 trillion, we only allocated 2.6 billion for skills. So of course we took a hiding, right? Because, I mean, we talked about it being integrated into the system, and yet we don't allocate sufficient resources. And so I think it's going to be quite important for us to leverage private sector, that we need to allocate sufficient resources, get institutions, support TVET colleges, private sector colleges, all manners of institutions for the post-school education system to be able to get towards that. So this is quite an interesting and very different take what we've done in the just energy transition sector, relevant to, comparatively so, to other sectors, which tend to pay a lot of lip service, but don't get very far on the traction of skills demand planning, and intelligence gathering. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And good morning, everybody. And how you do? Yeah. Welcome from the ILO. So my name is Olga, and Carmel, I think, reproduced my really difficult last name perfectly, but you forget about this last name. Olga is good enough. So I come from the ILO headquarters in Geneva, where I lead the team on skill strategies for future labor markets. So basically, that's what I do. That's my bread and butter, skill needs anticipation for the future, including greening, digitalization, and so on and so forth. So this morning we had a little chat with Prisha, and we were like, what should we tell, really? And it is really a little bit hard because, in fact, there is so much to tell, and at the same time, I feel it's a little bit a helicopter view for you because we have the full room of experts, people who really work on skills, and I think you can tell each one of you can tell the whole story, and I can learn a lot from you. So my take is a little bit providing a context, a little bit of challenges, possible responses, but it's a bit a helicopter view, the global view, because this is what we produce. But also, I must say that for me, it's very comforting and very pleasant to be in a community which actually appreciates research, because usually we deal with our development partners, and the dialogue we have would be, Olga, I can give you $1 million for this or that country. How many thousand jobs can you create out of that? And I'm dealing with skills. So my work is really skilling, creating programs for skills, but not jobs. So I think this is one of those questions. Can we really create jobs out of skills? I don't know what you think, but that would be something really interesting to discuss. So, and as a starting point, I want to say that, of course, you all know about all these wonderful global drivers of change. You all heard about them. I'm not going to repeat them. You know them. Especially some of them have been very, very medialized. But since we discussed today primarily just transition, and we used to use this expression just for the transition to the green economy and making sure it's just, yeah? But now we're actually starting using it more broadly. Just transition in a sense of multiple transitions will have to go through. And they are not functioning in separation. They are not existing in isolation, you know? So if we take an example of this interaction between digital and green, of course, digitalization may potentially reduce the carbon footprint. We all know how the COVID-19 had the effect on the emissions. In New York alone by half, imagine. And worldwide, this was a really unintended effect, but it was a very positive effect. But I think the world actually hasn't learned from that. We are going back to where we were at the start. And it's nice to have a face-to-face meeting, but it's also a huge carbon footprint, unfortunately. So digitalization may potentially reduce environmental footprint if it's done well, but digitalization itself also has a carbon footprint. Not that huge at the moment, but growing. And the prediction is it's going to grow in the future. And it's also a huge consumption for the energy. And of course, you know, there is a potential so through digitalization, through technological change, to facilitate the implementation of climate change policies and environmental policies and make it also more efficient. And if you think the same actually happens with other drivers of change. Now, trade, for example, of course, trade gives potentially facilitation of trade creates millions of jobs and millions of people can benefit from that, but it has a huge impact on the environment. And now we'll speak about digitalization of trade, which may be more positive for the environment, but it also brings disruptions to value chains. And what we see, there is a lot of reshoring, nearshoring, and localization of the supply chain, which might be good for the environment. But is it overall good for trade? And what is the impact on employment? Is it all positive, or will there be some losses? And if you think about demography, also know some part of the big parts of the world are aging, and there are skill shortages. And Africa mostly is benefiting from young population. So there is a lot of mobility, which also has an impact on environment. But talent mobility may bring some solutions to the environment as well. Because of the aging of the population in all this advanced part of the world, the care economy becomes very important. And healthcare also has a huge carbon footprint. So there are all these interactions to keep in mind. And now, the point which I would like to make, that neither of those policies are neutral in terms of employment angle. You know, you can implement each one of those policies, putting your pro-employment glasses on, and implement it in a way which is pro-environmental and pro-employment at the same time. But of course, this only is possible if you know what jobs will be created, what it means in terms of tasks, what it means in terms of skills. And if we know and we do it right, then skills basically may serve two purposes. And I think this is my answer to this basic question. Skills may become an enabler of the implementation of all those policies with the employment component. You may implement something environment intensive, carbon intensive, or you can implement a policy which is labor intensive or skill intensive. And ideally, we need to make sure, of course, that the policy creates jobs, creates growth, benefits from skills, but also creates good quality jobs. But also, what is important from the point of view of skills, availability of the right skills. It's a kind of a level playing field, because for example, trade has been accused for many years for creating a lot of inequality. So in fact, in order to benefit from trade better, we need skills available at very different levels and quite diverse also in terms of their composition by field and qualification. In this case, we facilitate also equity in the society, social cohesion. So it's also a buffer, social buffer skills, these two functions. Now, just to share with you a little bit of recent research findings from the ILO. So the Global Employment Trends for Youth, just published last year, made a projection by 2030 for employment by policy scenarios. And you can see that by these policy scenarios, like around 3/5 of the growth, potential growth of employment, is actually taken by the care economy, because it's very labor intensive and there is a huge potential. But the next one, right next one, actually comes green. So all green activities also have a unbelievable potential for job creation. Even digitalization, which is often accused, digitalization, technological change more generally, often accused, and automation and taking out jobs, also has a positive impact on employment. There's just a little bit of negative effect out of the interaction of those policy scenarios. Now, we had this report produced just a couple of years on the awards on digitalization before we go into green, on changing demand for skills in digital economies and societies. It's kind of, again, it's a world view. So the point which I would like to make here is that digital skills, because very often we speak about digital skills, they're very important. What are they? So we found out that digital skills are just a subset of skills which are needed for the digital transition. Yeah. So basically, if you look at digital skills, there could be basic digital skills, transversal ICT skills. These are those skills which you can apply across different jobs, but these are ICT skills, really. And intermediate and advanced digital skills, which are more specific for sectors. They are, of course, needed, but along with social and emotional skills, communication, collaboration, teamwork, conflict resolution, emotional intelligence, and along with broader cognitive and metacognitive skills like analytical skills, critical thinking, problem solving, foundational, numeracy literacy, environmental literacy, which becomes also one of the core skills, and research literacy, and other specialized technical skills. So that is basically the picture. For the transition to be successful, it's not just digital skills. And you will actually see that for the green transition, it's exactly the same point. I think I'll just skip that slide for the sake of keeping the time. So just continuing a little bit on the projections. In 2018, the ILO produced the report World Economic and Social Outlook, which looked specifically at the prospect of the green transition in terms of employment. And it did produce results by 2030, basically looking at the implementation of the commitments to the Paris Agreement, so that the temperature doesn't grow beyond 2 degrees centigrade, or preferably 1.5, by two scenarios. One, transition to renewable energy, and another one to circular economy. And you can see that even though in many countries, employment actually, in many regions, we are looking really at continents, in many regions, the result is expected to be positive. For Africa, the prediction is actually negative. And that is because the current economic structure, we're speaking about continents, so we are generalizing, of course, a little bit. But generalizing a little bit for the continent, the current economic structure very much is shaped around agriculture, which is a very polluting sector, extracting industries, fossil fuel energy generation, and some income generation for poor people, villages, rural workers that are also harmful for environment. So if this is not changing, if we don't really promote more diversification for the economy, this is going to be negative, because the pro-climate policy has to be implemented anyway. So we don't really want to choose between jobs and environment, because it's choosing between jobs and life, right? So that's why we need really to diversify economies here and to make sure that we have skills for that. So we had in 2019 a dive in, based on the projection which I just showed to you, for the world, on what it would actually take in terms of occupations by 2030 in these two policy scenarios, transition to renewable energy and circular economy by 2030. And you can see that in both scenarios, the net employment change is actually positive. This is blue, you see? But there will be also some losses, red. The good news is that out of those losses, most of them, that is for renewable energy, 5 million can be relocated to newly created jobs. But some may be lost. Some may be lost because these people do not benefit from the creation of occupations in their specialization in growing industries. But my argument always is we don't have to lose any job. We don't have to lose any job at all. We can just reskill these people into new qualifications. It's more challenging, but it's doable. And then the potential overall, because these two scenarios are not exclusive, maybe over 100 million jobs worldwide. In terms of gender, we also looked at these two policy scenarios. And we realized that who is going to benefit most of job creation, of green job creation, are men. But they're also the ones who are going to lose jobs. So there will be a lot of turnover. And of course, as any projection, this one is also based on trends in the past. And so this shows which green jobs, or that green jobs are now taken mostly by men. We want to really break that vicious cycle. If we want to break it, we need to train women, because the best way to get women into jobs is to train them for green jobs. And if we manage to do that, that's going to be a win-win situation, because we will need these people to implement the policies. In terms of skill levels, again, we looked in two scenarios, and you still see blue, light blue energy transition, dark blue circular. So most of jobs actually are going to be created at this middle skill level, but also quite a lot of loss. So there will be a lot of turnover. That means we need a lot of reskilling, upskilling for middle skill workers, also some for high skill workers. And you have some examples here of even new occupations created, for which we also need to prepare our qualification system. So agricultural meteorologists, for example, climate scientists, but a lot of them really in the medium skill level. These are operators, these are installers, these are all technicians, support staff. For low skill workers, really much less jobs. So you can see that relatively, compared to the past, there will be a high skill level need. And I think this is the key point I would like to make here. When you think about the green transition, very often we think about just renewable energies, waste management, and of course these are all green industries. But in fact, the change is much, much broader. So you see these two scenarios by occupation, and what occupations will be growing. So a lot of growth will be expected in building, for example, for the circular economy, in sales, because it's more service-oriented type of transition. So we would need not only environmental scientists or climatologists, we will need plumbers, we will need electricians, we will need manufacturing workers, and actually everybody, you and I as well. I also need to green and to learn how to green, even in the everyday activities. Because the way we produce, the way we serve, and the way we consume will have to change. And therefore, pretty much every job will be, to a different extent, but will be affected. That means we also need to adapt our systems of education. And as you saw, the greatest change happens actually at the middle skill level. That means it's technical vocational education training. And again, similar to the digital transition, we found out that core skills, those which are transferable across jobs, are super important for this transition to happen. And specifically for the green transition, this is also environmental awareness, but also marketing skills. Because imagine a plumber comes to a household to help to fix your pipes. And the plumber, who is actually aware of different solutions for water saving, energy saving, super important here, some renewable energy solutions, he might come, or she might come, and inform the household. So they become an advocate of a green change. So that's the little plumber becomes key for the environmental transformation. And marketing skills are super important in every job because of this. And leadership, that's another point. Leadership, if we don't have really leadership being aware of the importance of the environmental change is not going to happen. And my colleagues are saying that I have to hurry up. So just to bring it to the Just Transition Framework, since we speak about Just Transition, in 2015, the ILO constituents, that means all members, governments, employers, and the workers' representatives, agreed about the framework for Just Transition. And why is it important? It's important because it says that, yes, skills development, active labor market policies are key to implement, but among other policies. There are other policies such as social protection and the enterprise policies, social dialogue, and others that are also key for this implementation, including labor market institutions, because they are the ones to match skills and jobs and to provide training. So we have a couple of tools, actually. This one is on greening, the Greening TVET toolkit that takes the implementation from the point of developing standards, green standards for competencies and qualifications, up to teachers training as well, and Greening Campus. And we also have a tool for trade. So that's something super important also for Africa, since the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement has been adopted, and that it's very ambitious. So the ambition is to abolish the trade barriers and promote more trade, including digital trade. And of course, it will create many jobs. But again, in order to make sure that everyone can benefit from those jobs, and we can translate that trade into growth and employment, we need skills. So we have this tool which is called Skills for Trade and Economic Diversification. That will go back to my starting point, diversification, which we have implemented in all those countries. And it's a very interactive tool. Of course, we do have some diagnostics based on data. You need data to anticipate skill needs. But the rest happens very interactively, together with sectoral representatives, to make sure that the strategies they develop also include the skills component, just like Rudy was presenting. So we are looking at the business capabilities which are needed to make that sector more competitive, to diversified product services markets, and what in terms of skills will be needed in order to make sure that that sector can benefit from trade. So in terms of the general recommendations, I think I have said quite a lot already. But the last point, really, all those different drivers of change, many of them really are linked to different policies. So the key is really to coordinate. And I think Rudy actually spoke about this as well. Very often we see perfect policies, climate policy, environmental policy, trade policy. There is no single word on skills. Who is going to implement them? Where are the hands, where are the heads to implement those wonderful policies? So these we need to coordinate across different ministries and with the private sector. So that's why also the social dialogue with the private sector is the key here. We need to anticipate, we need to target the measures, because this is not, the policies, they are not getting implemented by default. And it's not also by default that women will benefit from them or young people will benefit from them. So therefore, we need also to think how this policy will integrate specific target groups and how we can skill them so that they benefit from that. I think I'll just stop there. You can find a lot of more information on our website, of course. And thank you.
on still? Yes. Okay. So we've heard from the ILO, I think, some really kind of inspirational ideas. Carmel said this panel might be depressing. I think we've heard some inspirational ideas about what's possible. We've heard some really interesting ideas from Rudy about how the South African government is planning. Those of us who live in South Africa know the challenge in South Africa is the shift from plan to implementation, but let's not go there for now, Rudy. What we want to share as a team, and there's three of us here, we are representing a much bigger team. Marcus, the PI of the project, introduced it last night, and there's a whole range of colleagues from the different countries who will be presenting throughout the conference. So in this session and the following session, a few of us are just going to represent the team to present a few preliminary insights. We are still involved in the data analysis, so this is just our initial findings. But what we're going to give a bit of insight into is what is happening in manufacturing companies, and what does this mean for how we think about what skills can and can't do. And we're really doing it in relation to two key kind of policy visions. The one is, if you have a skilled workforce, companies will be able to industrially transform and grow. And this idea comes to us, I think, ready-made from countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, because they do have a skilled workforce, and wow, companies can use that skilled workforce. So that's great. So all we have to do in low and middle income countries is get the skilled workforce, and then our companies will also be able to grow and develop. So that's the one kind of policy vision. And the other policy vision is, if you provide skills training to marginalized groups, they'll get jobs. So not only will we have industrial transformation, but we'll also have inclusive job creation, inclusive growth. So we set out to explore, how is that actually happening? Is this moving? Yes. So how is that actually happening? To what extent are formal vocational education and training systems contributing to industrial transformation? In what ways? What is the role of other training, company-based training, non-formal, informal training? What stops vocational education from playing this envisaged role? And is it leading to inclusive job creation and growth? And as Marcus introduced yesterday, these are the 6 countries in our study. We have representatives from all of our country teams who are going to answer all the difficult questions. As Marcus explained, it was mixed method research. We did a company survey and in-depth interviews in companies, with government policymakers, with industry associations, and with TVET providers. And we found that there are relationships between formal TVET systems and industrial transformation, and to some extent inclusive growth, but these relationships are really complicated. So what this table shows is, and this is based on interview data, the qualitative data, what the different groupings felt about the extent to which TVET systems are assisting in company-level industrial transformation. And it's quite interesting that you'll see that government providers in general felt that across the industrial sectors that we looked at, TVET systems are important for industrial transformation and growth. TVET providers in general also quite favorable, with a few exceptions. Industry associations, which we found quite surprisingly, were also quite favorable. And where you start seeing criticism is at a company level. So many people who research in this area will not be that surprised, but it is kind of a stark finding. Then we asked them also, does the formal TVET system facilitate growth? And you see a similar kind of picture, moving from green, very positive perception from government TVET providers and industry associations, to a much more critical perspective, with some exceptions, which are interesting. And as I said, we'll try and touch on a few of them now, but it's mainly going to be really in the more in-depth dives in the rest of the conference, in the panel sessions, where you'll get that, where we unpack what is underneath those exceptions. So 4K is going to now look at what are we really seeing from a company perspective? Because it seems, just from speaking to the companies, that formal TVET provision is not playing the role that policymakers aspire to, as we heard earlier, but also what policymakers actually believe is the case in their countries.
Great, thanks very much. So there are two ways actually in which companies can use TVET qualifications or programs, right? They can either hire graduates with those qualifications, or they actually use the programs to upskill their own workforce. And that's how we try to actually look at it from a company's side. And we wanted to understand which companies and how many companies are actually taking up those opportunities, right? How many companies actually use TVET programs in the hiring process? How many companies actually use TVET to upskill their own workforce? So this, what we're showing here are basically the number or the share of firms. We had close to 900 firms that we interviewed over 6 countries. So we've got a nice representation countrywide as well as industry representation. And you can actually see that in terms of hiring, there's sort of a slightly higher uptake, and there's definitely a skills hierarchy that we can see. So with general workers, there's actually sort of no uptake in the hiring, but it sort of increases as we would expect, sort of with higher skill requirements, right? But when we start looking at upskilling, very little, right? So the blue color basically shows companies that report absolute no uptake. Orange refers that they use one sort of formal training program, and then sort of the other colors show sort of 2 or more. So generally, very little uptake for skilling, a little bit more sort of when we look at the hiring of graduates. So if that's the case, what does then explain that companies take up formal programs? And we again wanted to understand sort of the hiring process and the upskilling process. And we looked at activities or characteristics that would explain why a company would use that. And that's very much sort of driven by the literature, by sort of what we know, how TVET programs are supposed to actually help companies. So we looked at some of the company characteristics in terms of age, foreign ownership, and then changes that companies might have experienced that might be correlated with the uptake. Older companies are more likely to actually use TVET programs, and that seems to be sort of sensible. They're more embedded in the industries, they know them better, and they most probably have influenced the programs themselves. Interesting enough, foreign ownership is negatively correlated with the uptake. And we will hear a little bit more about it, but that's most probably because they have got their own training programs, or actually they bring in trainers from overseas. When we look at the typical changes, workforce organization, introducing more advanced technologies or advanced products, very little uptake actually in the hiring process for the lower skill levels. Technicians, higher management, again, a more positive correlation. But what we see, and it came through some of the presentations before, integration in global markets actually make a difference, right? So they actually sort of seem to drive more sort of the use of formal programs or not. We see a similar picture actually when we look at upskilling. So if that's then the case, thank you very much, right? If you think about it, what we've got is the following. The company is the one that makes the decision if they use formal programs or not, right? But companies actually are nested. Companies nested in an industry, and industries are nested in a country, right? So it's the environment as well that will determine the uptake. And we wanted to understand if it's the company decision more, or the characteristic of the company, or the environment that actually drives this process. And what these graphs here show very quickly, and tells us how much our model could explain the uptake of formal programs, right? And it's cumulative. It basically means as the bar gets bigger, the model, as we included more, could explain more of the uptake. So what does blue and orange refer to? Blue and orange is basically what I just showed you, company activities, right? And they explain very little of the uptake. What explains more are industry or country characteristics. And we see this in the hiring process as well again as the upskilling process, and it differs again across the different occupational levels. Right? So I thought that was sort of a really interesting finding that we had across our different countries and industries. And based on that, I would like to pass back to Stephanie to take us further. Thank you. Well, I can still very quickly talk about this. It just refers basically to what we just seen, right? So we do see actually that the use of programs does differ significantly across the different industries, right? So for instance, as we would expect, the automobile industry, very few companies reported no use of formal programs. And when companies report the use of formal programs, they tend to use more than one. Right, so they seem to be quite involved in that process. When we look sort of at the garment industry or the pharmaceutical industry in Bangladesh, uptake of VST programs was actually very small. That was in order to hire technician, right? So we looked particularly at the one where we actually had sort of significant uptake. And when we start looking at the upskilling again, the diagram on the right, very few companies use formal programs. Pharma industry, I think it's close to 90% who actually didn't use any formal programs for upskilling, followed by garment. But which companies actually did use it a lot? The automotive industry. And again, I think we will see also reasons why that is the case. Thank you.
Yeah, and so just very briefly, what this diagram shows you, oh, didn't move, sorry, is that training is happening. There's a lot of training happening. But in some, formal training through public TVET provision barely contributes to industrial transformation. Formal TVET systems are not the key factor which is enabling companies to make decisions about the introduction of new technologies and products. We also find in some cases, even where there is actually industrial transformation, in some cases where there is industrial transformation, training does follow, but it's mainly on the job, informal, ongoing, informal, company-based. There's a few examples of formal dual type training, but in the main, not offered through public TVET provision, offered usually through big multinational type companies who have training in the plant, basically. So, and in some cases, even where there is industrial transformation, training doesn't follow. Even on the job, informal training doesn't follow. So we found some examples in Cambodia where actually the company just gets new technicians supplied from the supplying company. Sometimes industrial change leads to lower demands for skills. We found some examples of that in Bangladesh. Moving on to the next point, which is, does the formal TVET system facilitate inclusivity? Now, this table is quite interesting because here all the stakeholders are kind of in agreement. Even the companies say that, yes, formal TVET is great to help marginalized groups in accessing labor markets. So stakeholders have a positive view, and our findings suggest a quite different picture. Our findings suggest that these interventions actually aren't helping marginalized groups, partly in relation to what Volker has already showed us, that there's very low levels of use of low-level TVET qualifications in hiring. So just to unpack this a very, very little bit, Shimu from our Bangladesh team is going to share some insights from the Bangladesh case.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. From Bangladesh team, I would like to show about this inclusivity in Bangladesh garment sector. In this table, it shows that the TVET providers definitely consider the marginalized groups in their offering program, and some of NGOs that collaborate with the companies, garments industries, have introduced non-formal out-of-firm TVET program to promote the girls to mid-level positions in the industry. But participation of women in the non-mid-level occupation courses is very limited or sometimes non-exist. And this figure shows that what farm says. They don't use TVET qualifications in hiring or training at the lower level occupations. In this, okay. No, sorry. Okay. And actually, sorry. Okay. This is another picture is the skill formation regime of Bangladesh is still not effective for women to be employed in mid-level occupations in the garments industry. And clearly, women's participation in the work farm is a complex issue dominated by many socio-economic forces, along with the skill formation regime, which needs more research and coordinated measures to repair. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Shimu. Sorry, what? I see. For the sorry. Okay, so basically, what we are seeing is that formal TVET is playing a minimal role in relation to inclusivity. We've already seen that it's playing a minimal role in relation to industrial transformation and growth. In relation to inclusivity, formal programs are really focusing on low levels in large numbers, but employers are not looking for formal programs for low-level employees. The majority, where there is demand at higher levels, the qualifications are not accessed by women, which I think is very clearly coming through in the Bangladesh case. But the other kind of complexity in our countries is that while the kind of discourse of marginalized groupings seems to be a discourse that comes from the global north, but actually in our countries, most people are marginalized. Our economies are mainly informal, and most people are poor. So when we interviewed companies about are these programs helping marginalized groupings, they were reflecting on their workforce and they were saying yes, because the people who we are hiring are poor people. So there's a kind of a disjunction between how marginalization is thought of, I think particularly in the development and donor community, and the kind of harsh structural reality in our countries. So I know I'm really rushing because we're quite over time in this session, but I think what we want to leave you with for now is that, and we will be presenting a lot more from our project over the course of the 2 days, there are these two goals which are really in tension with each other: helping countries to industrially transform and helping the poorest of the poor, marginalized groupings access work. And possibly because countries, policymakers, donors and development agencies are trying to achieve both, maybe that explains why we're actually really not achieving either through our formal TVET interventions. Because clearly what seems to be the case is it seems to be a bit of a misguided policy idea that this is going to be a mass employment solution. So that we're just going to leave you with that kind of complexity and thought from our research. As I said, it is preliminary findings. We're still doing the analysis, and we are going to be talking more about other aspects of it later. But I know that we're very over time, so I'm handing over to the facilitators now.
Right. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I think I've been briefly introduced, but just my name is Alice. I'm representing the ILO office here in Pretoria. I'm skills specialist for the Eastern and Southern Africa countries based here in South Africa. So my pleasure to be with you this morning, and very happy to support the Real Center in the organization of this conference. I have now quite a difficult task, and that was only the first panel, so imagine what is coming after. I think we have already a lot of issues on the table. And if I can, it won't make justice, but just to summarize, I think we have, on one hand, the level of ambition, what we want to do and where we want to go, and what we think should be done. We got some insight from international level organizations, some warning of what the trends are saying and telling to us what is missing, what are the risks. And then we have a reality check on this interconnect between industry and TVET, which is at the core of our discussion. And the question of the panel was, what can skills do and don't, no? And what can we possibly do or actually not do from this perspective? To start answering these questions, I would like to invite 3 respondents that are helping us in mapping out some of the possibilities or some of the challenges, and then we will open the floor. All this will happen in the next 20-25 minutes, and then we break for coffee. So first of all, Rebecca Tron, Head of Economic Growth from the British High Commission. You are our first respondent. And I would like to ask you a very difficult question, actually. But one thing that we heard is that it seems that we have to simultaneously promote economic diversification, new value chains that are not yet fully in place or developed, some of them with high job creation potentials, others important for just transition, but not really labor intensive. So economic growth, job creation, and diversification. And to do so, we need a strong skills base, which, from what I understand, perhaps we still don't have, or not in all the value chains and not in every country. So how can we do these things simultaneously? Because we know that the cycle of skills development, the typical skills development cycle, as you also highlight, it takes 5 to 10 years to be responsive to the industry. We hear that some of the companies feel this is not yet responsive enough. Yet we are in a hurry. Private sector needs the skills yesterday already. So how can we do these things simultaneously? And particularly to respond to the panel, do you agree with some of the next steps that were highlighted, particularly by Rudy in his presentation, considering that the UK is one of the investors in this Just Energy Transition Plan? Quite an easy question. Over to you.
Very easy question. Thank you so much. So my name is Rebecca Tron. I work at the British High Commission here in Pretoria, and I'm representing sort of development partners and their response. As I know everyone's a bit tired, I might try and function this with sort of a clickbaity title of how do you get development partners to pay for skills program interventions, which is very difficult. It is very difficult indeed. I spend months and months trying to get my own organisation to fund skills programming. And it's a real challenge because there is a huge global sort of evidence base on what works for skills, which a number of our panelists have spoken to today. And actually, generally what we see is that the evidence base supporting skills policy is modest at best, which is why it cannot be looked at in isolation. And I think that really sort of speaks to what everyone said today. So many things need to happen at the same time. And the challenges with skills policy and the challenges with getting development partners to invest in skill policy is that we can often be quite unaware of the continual challenges, and we can often repeat the same mistakes. And skills programming and labour supply policies face kind of continual challenges of cost. They're often seen as very high cost interventions that don't deliver on jobs. As you say, the donors will chase you, the ILO, we will, because we want to know how many jobs is this doing. And it's because we're continuously balancing with that counterfactual. Well, what if we did nothing? What if we did something else? What do we invest in another policy area? And so we're constantly navigating that. But what we do know is what shows promise of what works. And what shows promise that we should keep exploring. And the reasons why we have funded many of the panelists today is that actually what they are saying really touched upon that. So if I was to pick out within what they've said as a development partner, we look at and say that is fundable, is that sort of labour supply policies cannot operate in isolation. The private sector is a huge part of this, and private sector interventions, policies that work to support companies in the private sector to innovate, to grow, to tackle regulatory barriers are crucial to work in complementarity with the labour market supply side. And when we look at the labour market supply side, what you've seen some of our panellists say today is that we know it works and we know it has impact when it's able to help people access different labour markets and overcome sectoral and spatial mismatches. It is that transition coupled with trade and technology change and also supporting gender access into typically male-dominated sectors when you see labour market policies have impact. And actually, if you can address those and design skills interventions that's focused around tackling those, crossing those barriers and crossing those divides, you see labour market supply policies that do actually have impact. And that's how you have to frame it to overcome the typical, well, we don't want to invest in skills, it's a bad buy. It's a bad buy, we should do something else instead. And so if I was to take as an example the UK's role in South Africa, what are we doing, what are we funding, and how are we working in partnership with some of our panellists today to drive skills development? So I'm not sure if people can actually hear me or not. I'm just going to, great, okay. I'll just sort of explain what we're doing and why we hope it will work. So the first is in terms of our skills program. We have a joint skills program with South Africa. It's been running for the past 3 years, and we work on different levels. And that is that we really believe, and in what so much has sort of been said today, and I think the last bullet point on the ILO presentation said it, is that you cannot have one intervention. We often debate the merits of wage subsidies versus job-seeking assistance versus TVET curricular upgrades, but actually it cannot happen in isolation, nor can it happen within one level of the system. So we look at taking a systemic approach to skills development. We support work with the Presidential Youth Employment Intervention, looking at the policy landscape and the overarching architecture of skills development in South Africa. We work within priority sectors, supporting TVET and industry in the sectors that Rudy highlighted, automotive, and I'm delighted our automotive partners are here today. We were at an event yesterday with them, installation, repair and maintenance, and green skills. And we work in supporting access for women into historically male-dominated sectors. And we do that here in South Africa within the artisan industry. This program's coming to an end, and we're looking at a new program, and it's going to have a very big focus on the just transition, as so many things do at the moment. And the reason why we want to look at the just transition in South Africa, why we want to take a systemic approach, why we want to complement and support the systemic approach taken and highlighted today, is that the just transition is fundamental to economic growth. We have seen no example in human history where poverty reduction has happened without economic growth. And if we look at what has driven economic growth, often that has been tied with energy. The Industrial Revolution brought huge wealth to the world and was driven through coal. We look at oil and what that has done for wealth generation within the countries that have it. And the countries that is able to put themselves on the front foot in leading the just energy transition and driving the sustainable green technologies and renewables as the energy source of the future will be the country that drives the next wave of economic growth. And South Africa has both the opportunity and the potential to drive that. And that is why UK is looking to support South Africa's just energy transition, but it won't do that in just one way. So yes, we will be looking at supporting labour market policies that drive just transition. We will also be investing through the Just Energy Transition Partnership, direct financing to support that. We finance subnational government work and look at urban economic development because it cannot happen just at a national level. We support economic reform. And we also support business, and we do direct support for business to help them overcome regulatory barriers, help them access new markets, and particularly within South Africa in the green tech and renewable sector. And I hope that sort of highlighted at every level sort of systems thinking is needed, both in terms of the sectors and interventions we have, but both in terms of when we're looking at skills interventions, we're looking at the skills system, working at every level and looking at how do you access and transition to new markets and challenge historical mismatches. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thanks for highlighting both your views on possible entry points, but also what is in the pipeline from development partners and particularly from your perspective. Sorry, I have this very annoying role of when I come closer to the podium, it means that we have to move on to the next speaker. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our social partners. As ILO, as you know, we work with governments and we work with social partners, the employers, organizations and trade unions organizations. And we have here two representatives that are actually from the SADC level industry associations, private sector forum, and SATUC, the trade unions at the SADC level, which is very interesting because it encompasses a few countries at once. I would like to start with Eileen, if you want to join me here. Eileen van der Rest, the coordinator for the Private Sector Forum in SADC. And my question to you is related to actually some of the trends that we have seen emerging from the study that was presented by Stephanie and colleagues. This disconnect, there seems to be a bit of disconnect between what companies consider relevant and what industry associations consider relevant. We have seen in some of the figures that, yes, TVET, technical training, vocational training is happening, but to the perception of some of the companies is not so relevant, particularly in the sectors that seem to be the priority sectors on which we want to invest. But then some industry associations consider it quite relevant. It seems to be inclusive according to all the stakeholders, but is it really TVET driving this economic diversification that we need? From the perspective of the private sector and the industry associations, what do you think the priorities are to make TVET more relevant? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what we need to start asking ourselves is, do we have the right industrialization and economic development strategies so that when we form these trainees, that they are aligned, the TVET trainees, they are aligned to our strategy. For the private sector, formal TVET seems to play a minimal role in relation to inclusivity in different sectors, like we have seen. There are some skills that are created, but these do not match the requirements of the industry. So there is need to build a more collaborative approach, especially with the private sector at all levels, starting from policies, curricula for different sectors. Otherwise, what we are seeing is that TVET produce skills that are not relevant to the industry. Therefore, the industry find it difficult to absorb those skills. We see a challenge within SADC that we do not have the right skills. Therefore, companies end up importing the skills, which is a challenge, which is a cost to companies in different countries. And also the regulations make it difficult even for those companies to export those highly skilled employees. Therefore, what we need to do is, yes, let's align our skills development and lifelong learning policies with other policies. Let's engage more. As SPSF, SADC Private Sector Forum, in our strategic plan, we have a pillar where we are promoting, enhancing the skills development for labor market needs. So this is a very important and critical conversation with the private sector. Because investment in reskilling and upskilling is very crucial for business. Business cannot grow without upskilling or without reskilling the employees. It's more challenging for the industry, but with engagement with different training institutes, it can be done. Thank you.
Thank
you very much. Thank you very much, Eileen, and also for flagging the importance of policy coherence that was also mentioned in some of the presentation. We will go back during the debate, and we just to remind the audience that then when we open the floor, you can ask questions to the speakers or to the respondents. So it will be a general discussion. But last but not least, let me come to our next respondent, who represents the workers' voices and the unions in the region, Patrick Siamong, representative from SATUC. I would like to take the opportunity of having you here to also go back to actually the just transition concept. And we know that in the ILO, it's from the unions that we started crafting this concept. And actually, the just transition agenda was very much promoted by the trade unions and the workers' associations over the years. We also know that very often it's a trade-off. Do we need to create jobs, or do we need to lose some jobs in order to allow more sustainable development? We know that some of those jobs that will be lost will not be immediately replaced. We know that many transitions have to happen to protect workers that have no immediate access to the new job opportunities. So when you create one job, it's not for granted that the person that has lost the job is going to get one immediately after. So maybe just generally from your perspective, is the way that we are framing just transition here something that you would agree with? What you heard from the different speakers, is that the just transition concept that we have in mind? And then looking at the trends that are emerging from the research, we see that it seems that training courses are considered as quite relevant, formal training, but also among the interview stakeholders, they all belong to the formal sector. So how inclusive are we of the voices of the informal economy and informal workers and informal sectors? No? And are their views sort of reflected in this picture? So over to you, Patrick, and thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, the facilitator. Good morning, all protocol observed. Yeah, my name is Patrick from the SATUC. SATUC is Southern African Trade Union Coordination Council. Our major mandate or objective is just to provide decent work and better wage opportunities. Yeah, we are in support of this trade, just energy transition initiatives. But the big question is, like, we are supporting the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 on renewable energy. The big question is the commitment, especially from the African continent. So we have seen the NGOs are coming on board to support these initiatives. So the African region, especially leaders, they are not supporting these initiatives. Even the local commercial banks, they are so reluctant to invest in this just energy transition. So you can see already they're scared of this. And we have seen major governments embarking on new coal-powered power plants projects. So the big question, we are talking just energy transition, and we are seeing our government concurrently running new coal-powered projects. So that's the big question. What are we? Are we gambling or what? That's the big question. Yeah. I'll start with the youth perspective. The youth is the future everywhere, countrywide, worldwide. We need to give this youth formal employment. Unlike of now, we are giving them short-term fixed contract of 12 months. So how can we invest, like our vision is 2030, and we are not taking the youth on board? So that's a big question also. Why are we not giving them opportunities? Why are we not exposing them? Why are we not giving them permanent jobs? So that's the big question from the labor perspective. In the private partnership, the big question, there's a conflict always between union and the capitalists, with due respect. We are of the view of the social approach, the private partnership of the capitalist approach, which is profit-driven, and we are scared in terms of exploitation. our workers, are they going to be paid well? Because these things drive away the scale. You'll find that for developing countries, we need artisans or apprentices that fits into the TVET program. But if they are not paid well, they are going to digress. They are going to join, they are going to become tenderpreneurships. So that's where we are not going to close the gap. Because if these skills are not paid for, we are not addressing the problem at large. So, but in a nutshell, as a labor movement, we do believe that this just energy transition will create jobs, because some of these machines, they will be serviced by our workers. We need to upskill, we need to reskill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Now, I have to ask your flexibility and also accept our apologies because we are running out of time. So there is a proposed different approach to what we had initially in mind. Just to allow time for break, for discussions and bilateral engagements. So we would like to take 2 interventions from the floor. Not really questions, you can open a question, but your reflections. So anyone from the floor that would like to make a brief intervention of what you have heard. And then for the questions, specific questions, we have 2 suggestions. One is that you all have post-its. So if you can just write down your question and stick them on the wall next to the cameras, we will collect them, group them, and find a moment to address them in the next sessions. During the day, we cluster them because I know we also have many people in the room. So first, write your question down and put it on the wall. Second, engage during the coffee break with either the panelists or the respondents and try to have bilateral conversations as well. And third, which we're going to do now, the first 2 that raise their hands and want to make an intervention from the floor, we are very happy to open the floor, and I will inspire our conversation during the coffee break. I see one hand is there. It's like an auction. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Thank you. And you can introduce yourself.
Hi, Simon McGrath, University of Glasgow. Yeah. One of my reflections here was, having worked in the policy sphere and academia over more than a quarter century, is that while some of the specifics of the language have changed, we are essentially using much of the same language that we use in these venues over the last 25 years plus. So why are we going to get it right this time when policy has failed consistently? Not just skills policy, but policy more generally has failed to do these things right. So what's going to be different this time? So what have we learned about what doesn't work?
Thank you. And that's indeed, I think, the question for the entire 2 days. Remembering that we wanted to also include some not so optimistic views, but opportunities to answer. I think there was a, yeah.
Sure. Thanks so much. I don't get the chance to talk to so many different policymakers. I have just one question, maybe a little outside the scope of VET, but I think it's important. So let me start with a quick example. For example, if you think about vocational training in the context of, say, green skilling, but in many countries, fossil fuels are still quite highly subsidized. Say, I'm coming from Bangladesh, and that's true. So my question is, unless we take the demand side into consideration, just the supply side view may be quite inadequate to kind of promote vocational educational training or skills development. So I wonder we should bring that into consideration, discussion like this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So actually 2 very important things to take into account. One is how to be more demand-led, how to include demand perspectives into skills development, design, thinking, and programs. And then the most difficult question, which is how can we make things differently? Because we've been doing and saying these things for many years now. And then what can change? What has to change for us to make these linkages and these connections work better? With this, I wish you a very enjoyable coffee break. I thank you for your participation. We will open the floor later and come back at 11:30.